Hey everyone, Born Again RN. I apologize for the crudity of this video because I'm having some trouble with Streamyard. It's recording my presentation, but it's not recording my audio. So what this presentation is to answer the question, is the woman of Genesis 3:15, Mary, the mother of Jesus, who has enmity between herself and the serpent of Genesis 3? Also going to answer, is God saying specifically that it will be the seed of Mary rather than the seed of Eve who will have enmity between himself and the seed of the serpent? Lastly, is it Mary who will crush the head of the seed of the serpent rather than Christ crushing its head? These questions arise due to the Apostolic Constitution of Pope Pius IX in Ineffabilis Deus on the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, declared on December 8, 1854, a dogma that is binding for all Catholics to believe, which the Pope declared: the Most Blessed Virgin Mary, in the first instance of her conception, was preserved free from all stain of original sin, is a doctrine revealed by God, and therefore to be believed firmly and constantly by all the faithful. Hence, if anyone shall dare to think otherwise, let him know and understand that he is condemned by his own judgment, that he has suffered shipwreck in the faith, that he has been separated from the unity of the Church. In this papal constitution, Pope Pius IX attempted to argue from the writings of early ecclesiastical writers that it was Mary, not Eve, who was the woman of Genesis 3:15, and it would be Mary's seed, not Eve's seed, who would crush the head. These ecclesiastical writers, in quoting the words by which at the beginning of the world God announced his merciful remedies, prepared for the generation of mankind, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, that this most blessed mother, the Virgin Mary, was prophetically indicated, and at the same time, the very enmity of both against the evil one was significantly expressed. Unmistakable evidence that she, meaning Mary, crushed the poisonous head of the serpent. And hence they affirmed that the Blessed Virgin was, through grace, entirely free from every stain of sin and from all corruption of body, soul, and mind. First, we must look at the actual text to see who this woman is, beginning in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis 1:27 reads, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Genesis 2:22-23 details God's creation of mankind. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. The word woman is translated from the Hebrew word isha, which is also translated wife. Genesis 2:20 identifies this man as Adam. However, at this point of the creation story, Adam had not yet named this woman Eve. This would not occur until after the fall and after Genesis 3:15. Continuing in Genesis 3:1, Eve is still being referred to as woman in the following verses, translated from the Hebrew word isha, which again is also translated wife. Genesis 3:1, the serpent said to the woman. Genesis 3:2, the woman said to the serpent. Genesis 3:4, the serpent said to the woman. Genesis 3:6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food. Genesis 3:8, the man and his wife, Isha, also translated woman, hid themselves. Genesis 3:12, the woman whom you gave to me to be with me. Genesis 3:13, then the Lord God said to the woman, what is this you have done? And the woman said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. At this point, Genesis 3 is consistent that the woman is Eve, not Mary. But even after Genesis 3:15, the woman is still clearly Eve. Genesis 3:16, to the woman God said. Genesis 3:17, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, Isha, also translated woman. Genesis 3:20, the man called his wife's Isha name Eve. Genesis 3:21, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife, Isha. Eve is referred to as woman or wife no less than 16 times, both before and after Genesis 3:15, because Adam would not rename the woman Eve until verse 20, 5 verses after Genesis 3:15, where God prophesies that the seed of the woman. So there is no reason to think God suddenly shifted the woman in Genesis 3 to refer to Mary in verse 15, and then suddenly shifted the woman back to Eve in verse 16. Therefore, the woman in verse 15 is clearly Eve, not Mary, and therefore it is Eve who has enmity with the serpent, not Mary. Furthermore, in Genesis 4:1, Eve understood God was referring to herself as the woman of Genesis 3:15, not some future woman. Now, the man had relations with his wife, Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. However, the words translated the help of are not found in the Hebrew text, but added by a later translator. So the text better translates, I have gotten a man-child with the Lord, or more specifically, I have gotten a man, the Lord. This means Eve not only correctly understood God was referring to her being the woman of Genesis 3:15, and it would be her seed, but this is the first biblical evidence of the future Messiah being God himself. The Hebrew word zerah, translated seed, can also be translated descendant, meaning the seed of the woman would be a descendant of the woman Eve, but not necessarily her immediate offspring. So although Eve was wrong about the seed being Cain, she was right about the seed being her descendant, which would be Christ. This is also used this way in Greek, such as in Galatians 3:16. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ. Obviously, seed doesn't mean Christ was Abraham's immediate offspring, but his descendant. So Christ is the seed or descendant of Eve from Genesis 3:15, not Mary's seed. So even though Eve was wrong about Cain being this specific seed, she understood correctly God was referring to her seed or her descendant rather than some future woman's seed or immediate offspring, which isn't even implied in Genesis 3:15. There is no biblical reason to believe Eve understood God to be referring to some future woman. Now, some will argue the dogma declared by Pope Pius IX in Ineffabilis Deus is multifaceted, meaning it could refer to both Eve and Mary. However, the Pope didn't allow for this assumption in this apostolic constitution when he declared this dogma, when he wrote, the Virgin Mary was prophetically indicated, and at the same time, the very enmity of both against the evil one was significantly expressed, unmistakable evidence that she, meaning Mary alone, crushed the poisonous head of the serpent. So there is no room in Ineffabilis Deus, when the Pope declared this dogma, for this woman to refer to anyone except for Mary, including Eve. Even though the text of Genesis 3:15 is explicit, the woman is indeed Eve and only Eve. Furthermore, Romans 16:20 makes it clear it is Christ who does the crushing, not Mary. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The confusion by the Pope in believing the woman is Genesis 3:15 is Mary rather than Eve comes from him using the faulty Clementine Vulgate, the later version of the Vulgate, which replaced Jerome's Latin Vulgate, which mistranslated Genesis 3:15 as she will crush his head, which was later corrected back to he will crush his head in the 1979 Roman Catholic Nova Vulgata, which is supported by the Hebrew, the Greek Septuagint, and Jerome's original Vulgate translated into Genesis 3:15. Furthermore, in a letter written in August 2000 by the very Reverend J. Augustine Denosa, Executive Director of the Secretariat for Doctrinal and Pastoral Practices, he lists 6 scriptural passages, including Genesis 3:15, stating, I would think a case could be made that the Catholic Church has defined something about the correct interpretation of the following passages. So Denosa isn't even saying these passages have been infallibly interpreted by the Catholic Church, including Genesis 3:15, only that it defined something about the correct interpretation of them. Moreover, Catholic Answers senior apologist Jimmy Akin recently conceded in an interview the dogma of the Immaculate Conception has never been infallibly declared. Has never been infallibly declared either by a pope or a magisterium, including in an ecumenical council, which you can hear him admitting here.
But if I'm asked what the Church's teaching is, what level of authority it has, and whether there is any possible way a person who disagreed could be a Catholic, I'm going to give him a straight answer. So I said, the Church does teach that she remained sinless because she didn't have original sin. She remained sinless, unlike Adam and Eve. They were also born immaculate, but they went on to sin. Mary did not. She made better decisions than Adam and Eve. That's the Church's teaching. The Church teaches she did not go on to sin. She didn't have personal sin. But it hadn't infallibly defined that. That is not something that has been infallibly defined by a council or a pope. And so even though it's the Church teaching, and even though some theologians would say, well, it's not a matter of faith, but it's proximate to the faith, formally speaking, this is a non-infallible teaching, and therefore, if one had really good reasons, one hypothetically could disagree as an exceptional case.
Yet, Pope Pius IX bound every Catholic to believe in this dogma. This is because when the Pope declared this dogma in 1854, he didn't declare it ex cathedra, since the doctrine of papal infallibility wasn't defined until 16 years later in 1870 at the Ecumenical Council of Vatican I. So this dogma was fallibly defined by the Pope. Yet, Pope Pius IX bound every Roman Catholic to believe in this dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, threatening, if they deny this dogma, that he is condemned by his own judgment, that he has suffered shipwreck in the faith, and that he has been separated from the unity of the Church, despite it not being infallibly defined either by the Pope himself nor the magisterium, since the declaration of this dogma did not take place in an ecumenical council. So why bind all Roman Catholics to believe in a dogma with threat of excommunication for denying it, even though it has not been infallibly defined either by a pope ex cathedra nor by the magisterium? Additionally, the Pope used a faulty Latin translation, which mistranslated Genesis 3:15 as she to refer to Mary rather than he to refer to Christ, for biblical support for the Immaculate Conception, which the Pope had undeniably erred. So the woman in Genesis 3:15 is clearly Mary, not Eve, and it is Jesus, not Mary, who would crush the head of the serpent. So there is no biblical evidence for the 19th century dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which was fallibly, not infallibly, defined by the Pope.